Hey guys, how's it going? Jordan Locke here. Everyone's favorite Republican corporate puppet, Nikki Haley, was at a town hall meeting in New Hampshire recently, and I guess the purpose of this meeting was to try to shore up her poll numbers in New Hampshire. And so she was essentially just relating her policy and her platform to the attendees of this meeting. And the attendees, the way these town hall meetings work is that the attendees get to ask the candidate questions about their platform. And during this meeting, one of the attendees asked Nikki Haley what she thought the cause of the Civil War was, the American Civil War. And in a dazzling display of malice and callousness that's pretty typical with the Republican Party, to be honest with you, she proceeds to contort history and act like the South wanting to continue the horrible institution of slavery was not the reason why the Civil War happened in this country. Now, what happened here with Nikki Haley was very loaded, right? This was not a casual slip of the tongue. This was not an innocent momentary lapse of memory. This was very, very deliberate on Nikki Haley's part. Nikki Haley was essentially towing the Republican line with the response to this question. And the MAGA extremist and Republican line, when it comes to the topic of slavery, is to try to erase and marginalize it as much as possible, right? So in this video, we're gonna be going over a lot of the reasons as to why Nikki Haley and the overall Republican Party in general, whether we're talking about MAGA extremists or more moderate Republicans, they all agree on a couple of things, actually. And this is one of the things that they agree on, and that is to erase and marginalize the period of slavery in this country as much as possible. But before we get into this topic, if you support progressive political commentary, LGBT rights, women's rights, diversity, equality, and just democracy in general, please like and subscribe to this channel because I will be bringing you lots of that type of content. So Nikki Haley responded to this question, and we're going to watch the clip in a little bit here, but she responded to this question in a very deliberate manner in order to appease the Republican base, right? The Republican voters, the supporters, and toe this sort of Republican Party line that tries to, in effect, marginalize and erase slavery. Now, keep in mind, this is the same political party that gets extremely upset when state governments remove statues to traitorous Confederate generals in the South.
Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments, Trump tweeted. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. Who's next? Washington? Jefferson? So foolish. Trump's apparently referring to scenes like this, statues being toppled in Durham, North Carolina. In Baltimore, the city taking down similar statues overnight, numerous other cities around the country planning to do the same in what has now become a national debate.
Right, you remember that whole thing where that was a big thing a couple of years ago, and it's actually still happening now. It just happened recently, I want to say a couple of weeks ago, in I believe Mississippi. It was either Mississippi or Alabama. These supporters, this Republican political party and this political party line to try and marginalize and erase slavery, these are the same people who get extremely upset when local governments remove statues to traitorous Confederate generals who were traitors to our American flag. They get upset at the removal of these statues because they say that this is erasing an important part of history. These people who complain that removing these Confederate general statues are erasing a part of history are the same people who are trying so hard to erase the legacy of slavery and to erase the period of slavery in the history of this country. So just keep that piece of hypocrisy in mind while we go ahead and watch this clip. Let's roll the clip.
What was the cause of the United States Civil War?
Well, don't come with an easy question or anything. I mean, I think the cause of the Civil War was basically how government was going to run, the freedoms and what people could and couldn't do. What do you think the cause of the Civil War was? I'm sorry?
I'm not running for president. I wanted to see your
That's a good thing.
On the cause of the Civil War.
I mean, I think it always comes down to the role of government and what the rights of the people are. And I will always stand by the fact that I think government was intended to secure the rights and freedoms of the people. It was never meant to be all things to all people. Government doesn't need to tell you how to live your life. They don't need to tell you what you can and can't do. They don't need to be a part of your life. They need to make sure that you have freedom. We need to have capitalism. We need to have economic freedom. We need to make sure that we do all things so that individuals have the liberties so that they can have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to do or be anything they want to be without government getting in the way.
Thank you. And in the year 2023, it's astonishing to me that you answer that question without mentioning the word slavery.
What do you want me to say about slavery?
No, you've answered my question. Thank you.
Next question.
So yes, unfortunately, your ears and eyes do not deceive you. This is Nikki Haley pretending that the institution of slavery was not the primary reason why the Civil War happened in this country. Now, for those of you who aren't necessarily from this country, you may not have a firm grasp on American history, or even if you are from this country and you're not fully caught up on U.S. history, I'm just going to briefly touch on what that period of slavery was in this country. So the slave trade started in 1619, or the American slave trade started in 1619, and what the slave trade entailed was kidnapping and capturing Africans, bringing them across the Atlantic Ocean to the U.S. and having these Africans work on plantations in the South, right, in southern states. Now, slavery obviously placed a lot of Africans in very brutal, inhumane conditions, picking cotton, growing sugarcane, growing tobacco, this sort of thing, in order to enrich southern plantation owners. Now, not only did these slaves not get paid for this work, but they were terrorized. They were brutalized and abused and oftentimes beaten and killed, right, for the slightest of transgressions or perceived transgressions from their masters. These slaves were forbidden from learning, from educating themselves, right? Because obviously with education comes power. And coincidentally, the leaders of the Republican Party know this, which is why educating yourself is quite often shunned in the Republican Party, right? What did Donald Trump say that one time, that he loved the uneducated?
We won with poorly educated. I love the poorly educated.
So yes, these slaves were not allowed to educate themselves. They were not allowed to learn how to read, to do math. They were simply to be used as vessels to do work, and that's it. So you might ask yourself, why did Southerners participate in this horrible and brutal institution of slavery? And the answer is very simple. Because this institution of slavery, despite how brutal and inhumane it was the driving force behind the South's economy. It was essentially the economic engine of the South. Production of cotton, production of tobacco, sugarcane. These were things that brought the South a lot of money in that time period in the 1800s and 1700s. I think at one point the South was responsible for 75% of the cotton that was being used in the world. Now, that would be fine if it didn't come at the expense of treating other human beings like literal animals, worse than animals. That's where the problem comes in. So for the South, as long as they were getting this income from cotton, this income from tobacco, from sugarcane, it didn't matter that they were brutalizing an entire race of people. That part wasn't important. The part that was important to them was the economic benefit of having these people work for free and reaping the benefits of the global demand of cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco. So the slave trade happened for over 300 years, between 300 and 400 years. In terms of the amount of deaths that happened, no one is 100% sure how many people died or how many Africans died. Some say as little as 6 million Africans died. Not little, that's obviously a lot of people. But some people go so far as to say that 100 million African slaves died. And so we're not really sure what the exact number is. The UN says 17 million African slaves died. The number that's generally accepted by scholars is anywhere from 40 to 50 to 60 million Africans who died during this, century-long institution of slavery. So the takeaway from this is that this institution was horrible on many different levels, right? Families torn apart, people kidnapped, deaths, brutality, abuse on a scale not seen in history. I think that the American slave trade was actually the largest and most comprehensive and prolific slave trade in the history of this planet. So, luckily, at the same time that this entire slave trade was going on, in the South, They were people in the north of this country. And Northerners had a conscience and they had empathy, and they saw that what the South was doing was absolutely horrible. You cannot treat human beings like animals. You cannot treat them like they are merely tools to be disposed of when you're done using them. You cannot work people to the bone without paying them or giving them some kind of compensation in return. And so the North spoke out about this, right? The North spoke out against this evil institution where people were getting ripped away from their families and kidnapped and abused and worked to the bone for no pay and hung and all kinds of awful treatment. The northern states spoke out about this, and they said this cannot continue. This cannot be a part of this country. And the North saw the hypocrisy in the institution of slavery, right? All of these people in the southern states who call themselves good Christian men and women, who were, at the same time that they call themselves good Christians, were perpetrating the largest slave trade in the history of this planet. And so this entire thing created a rift between the American North and the American South, that is, states above the Mason-Dixon line and states below the Mason-Dixon line. And the South was essentially left with two options. Option one was to start being decent human beings and end the institution of slavery despite how much money they were making off of it, stop ripping families apart and stop treating people like tools and animals, and get rid of that entire institution and grow the South's economy another way, maybe, right? That didn't involve the brutalization of an entire race of human beings. Option two was to continue the institution of slavery and to continue allowing this brutal institution to be the economic driver of the South, despite the moral arguments against it, despite the Christian arguments against it, right? Which was very relevant to this because most of the Southern people at this time considered themselves Christians. So the second option was essentially to continue this horrible institution, right? Christianity be damned, morality be damned, humanity be damned, empathy be damned, just focus on profit. And that's the only thing that mattered. So which option did the South choose? They became traitors to their own country and their own flag in order to preserve their right to treat human beings like animals because it was economically beneficial for them. So that is how the Civil War started. The North was not going to allow them to continue doing what they were doing, and the South wanted the right to keep slavery going despite the Christian and the moral arguments against it, all in the name of making money. So that is the most important reason, the primary reason why the Civil War started in this country. Okay, so all of this history brings us to the current day situation with Nikki Haley and the overall take of the Republican Party on slavery. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Nikki Haley's response was very deliberate. This was not on accident, this was on purpose. This is the overall Republican MAGA party line when it comes to slavery. The effort here is to marginalize and erase it from history and pretend it never happened. Why do MAGA people, why do Republicans want to pretend that slavery never happened? Why do they not want to talk about it? Why do they not want this to ever be a topic of discussion? That's very easy to answer. The reason why Republicans and MAGA extremists don't ever want to talk about slavery and want to brush it under the rug is because the supporters, the constituency of the Republican Party, are those same people from the South who supported the institution of slavery. They are the same exact people. Now, there are a couple of excuses that the Republican Party and the MAGA extremists love to use when it comes to the topic of slavery. There are two main excuses that they love to use. The first excuse is that technically it was the Republican Party who freed the slaves, right? You'll always hear Republicans talking about this in an effort to draw minority voters away from Democrats. Why do minorities tend to vote Democrat? It's very obvious. It's the same reason why women tend to vote Democrat. It's the same reason why the LGBTQ community votes Democrat, because Democrats historically support equality and rights for those groups of people. So Republicans see this and they need a way to try to draw minority voters away from the Democratic Party. So one of the excuses they love to use is, oh, well, it was the Republicans who freed the slaves in the 1800s. So technically we freed the slaves, so you should be part of our party. What those Republicans purposely don't tell you is the fact that, yes, while technically the Republican Party freed the slaves, the two parties flipped. So Republicans became Democrats and Democrats became Republican. Now, the reasons for the parties flipping are kind of complex. They're kind of convoluted and kind of out of the scope of this video. So we can't really cover that, okay? But what you need to know about that is while the Republican Party did free the slaves, the Republican Party at that time were Democrats ideologically. And the Democrats were Republicans ideologically. The Democrats were the ones who were pro-slavery at that time. Between then and now, the parties have flipped. Republicans became Democrats and Democrats became Republicans. So the Republicans who freed the slaves in the 1800s became Democrats. They're ideologically the same group of people that switched to Democrat. And the Democrats of the Civil War era ideologically were the same as the present day Republicans. You know, their politics were anti-minority, pro-slavery, anti-LGBTQ, anti-women. All the same politics that the Republican Party has today were the Democrats at that time. So the next time you hear a Republican use that excuse, make sure you set them straight. And they know this, by the way. They know everything I'm telling you right now, but it doesn't suit their narrative. So they won't mention anything about the fact that the party's changed. The only thing they're interested in doing is feeding you the narrative that Republicans freed the slaves, which in and of itself is not true. So I do feel the need to briefly jump in here and state that not all Southerners supported slavery, right? This was certainly the majority take in the South, but there were actually Southerners who fought against slavery. A great example of this is a Southerner named Newton Knight, who actually fought with slaves and with other Southerners against the Confederate Army. And his story is actually documented in a movie starring Matthew McConaughey called Free State of Jones. It's an awesome, awesome movie. And I highly recommend that you watch this movie. But people like Newton Knight were certainly in the South, certainly fighting against the Confederate Army. The sad thing is they were most certainly a minority. It's pretty sad that the minority in the South were people fighting against such a horrible institution, and that the majority of people in the South actually supported this institution of slavery. It's a very sad chapter in life. But I did want to mention that not every Southern person was pro-slavery. There were certainly outliers to that, and Newton Knight is a great example of a Southerner who fought against slavery in the best way that he could in the South. The next excuse that Republicans love to use about slavery is the fact that, well, only a few wealthy plantation owners owned slaves. The rank and file Southern person didn't own slaves. Well, while that may be true, action and intent are two different things. Yes, the rank and file Southern man didn't own slaves because he didn't have the money to own slaves. That doesn't make him a morally better person because he couldn't afford to own slaves. The rank and file Southern man fought for the right to preserve slavery. So then it follows logic that if they fought to preserve slavery, they supported the institution of slavery. So just because these Southerners didn't have the money to own slaves, that doesn't make them any better than the plantation owners who were actually wealthy enough to own slaves. Ideologically, both were the same. Ideologically, both supported the institution of slavery and the subjugation of an entire human race. So neither one is morally superior to the other. They were both the same. They both had the same intent. It's just that one group had the money to act on their intent and the other group didn't. So at this point, we've established that the Republican Party of today, the MAGA extremists, and even their less extreme but still pretty extreme counterparts, the standard Republican Party, they're the same people ideologically that supported slavery back in the 1800s and that supported the institution of slavery and even fought to preserve slavery, became traitors to this country to preserve the institution of slavery. They are the same people ideologically, and that's why they work to erase this history of slavery. And the reason why they work to marginalize and erase this period in our history is because they know that they're the same people ideologically to those people who supported slavery back in the 1800s, and this looks very bad for them, right? It looks extremely bad. Why does it look bad for Republicans? Why does slavery look bad for them? Slavery looks bad because Republicans pretend to be the party of morality, right? They pretend to be the party who's preserving family virtues and the party of Christianity and the party of God, and they just want to do what God wants for the people. So on the one hand, they have to preserve this false narrative of virtue and morality and Christianity. But then on the other hand, they know that the picture that history paints of them is not a very good picture at all. Like we briefly touched on before, the Republicans today, the good Christian folk of the South, are the same exact good Christians who were enslaving people in the 1800s. They were the same good Christians who saw no problem with the institution of slavery and in fact supported the institution and were willing to become traitors to preserve the institution of slavery. Those good Christians of the 1800s who perpetuated the institution of slavery are the same ideologically as the good Christians of today, the Republican Party of the South, right? The Bible Belt Republicans, all of these people who pretend to have this air of morality about them, who at the end of the day couldn't care less about morality. It's all about preserving their rights, but they could care less about anybody else's rights. So that is the reason why the Republican Party tries so hard to erase this part of history. And I have to remind you again, right, just because of the sheer hypocrisy of it, these are the same people who get upset when governments are removing statues of traitorous Confederate generals. These are the same people who are waxing poetic about how you can't erase history and how we need to preserve history. Those same people who want to preserve history by honoring the statues of these Confederate traitors are the same people who want to erase history and marginalize history when it comes to the institution of slavery. So this is why overall the Republican Party tries so hard to erase slavery. And it's not just Nikki Haley, right? We saw it in Nikki Haley's response at this town hall meeting in New Hampshire, but it's not only Nikki Haley. This is the Republican Party line. We've seen this across the board. Recently, Ron DeSantis rewrote Florida law so that they can't teach what actually happened during the institution of slavery, during this period of American history. Instead, they rewrote Florida law so that educators have to paint slavery, the very horrible institution of slavery, in a much better, more positive light, right? So they're essentially rewriting history and telling young kids that slavery was actually beneficial to slaves because they learned skills. This is an actual thing that Ron DeSantis recently did in Florida. So in effect, what Ron DeSantis is doing with this law is negating and marginalizing the horrible history of slavery, the brutality of slavery, the abuse of slavery, the awful ramifications that slavery has had on an entire group of people for hundreds of years, and replacing that real part of history with their new narrative of what slavery was, which was a way to teach Africans how to use skills that would help them. So I bring this up to prove the point that it's not just Nikki Haley who's doing this. This is the entire Republican line. This is the MAGA line. This is a joint effort in erasing slavery because it looks so bad for the Republican Party. The same thing that Fox News does, right? Fox News never ever talks about, there's essentially a media blackout on any conservative news source, whether it's Fox News or whether it's any one of these far right, talk show hosts. They all have this huge media blackout on discussing slavery. They'll talk all day about the reactions to slavery. They'll talk all day about affirmative action and how it's so horrible and how it shouldn't be here, but they'll never talk about the reason why affirmative action was implemented in the first place. So the excuse that they've adopted to cover up the disgusting legacy of slavery is the fact that the Civil War was not fought for slavery, but instead fought for states' rights versus the federal government's rights, and how much power the federal government had over states. And this is the narrative that the Republicans love to spin. They love to use this narrative. And once again, we find more hypocrisy in the Republican argument, because even if you buy their excuse that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but was about states' rights and overreach of the government, even their own argument, even their own twisted narrative shows how hypocritical they are. So if you want to paint the history of the South and the history of the Republican Party in this new light, right? This revised narrative where it wasn't about slavery and it wasn't about subjugating an entire human race, but more so about states' rights and the government overstepping their authority. Sure, the government is going to overstep their authority when an entire half of this country shows us that they have no decency and no morality. Yes, these same people would love the government to step in and protect them if it had to do with protecting their rights, right? Republicans always pretend to be the party of law and order and decency. So they would love for the government to step in over states to protect their rights and their rights to freedom and their right to live. But when it comes to the government stepping in to protect other people's rights, in this particular case, the rights of the slaves, now suddenly it becomes a problem of the government overstepping their authority. Are you starting to see the hypocrisy of the Republican Party in general and how their arguments, their takes, their narratives don't hold up to any actual scrutiny? This is why Republicans don't deal in facts. This is why they deal in narratives. Because if you talk strictly facts with Republicans, more often than not, they have no moral ground to stand on. Right? So this is why Republicans don't like facts. This is why they're always trying to twist narratives and rewrite history. This is why Ron DeSantis rewrites Florida law so that people can't teach how awful slavery was, but instead that it was a way to help slaves gain skills. This is why Nikki Haley answers this question in this way. This is all part of a concerted effort to make Republicans look better than they actually are. Those people who are Democrats back then and Republicans now have the same exact ideology. The same way they fought against the rights of Africans, the rights of minorities back in the 1800s, the same way they fought to preserve this awful institution, this awful racist institution, they still fight today. They're still fighting to stop minorities from having rights. They're still fighting to stop women from having rights. They're still fighting to stop the LGBTQ community from having rights. They're still the same exact people. It's the same ideology. No one can have rights except for them. They're the only people who can have freedom and rights. Any other group, and you can be sure that the Republican Party is fighting to minimize the rights that that group has. So guys, at the end of the day, Nikki Haley's response is not indicative of just a lapse of judgment or a lapse of memory in a moment of time, right? This is even bigger than Nikki Haley. This is Nikki Haley towing the Republican Party line. We've just gone over many examples of other Republicans who toe the same exact line when it comes to the reason for the Civil War and indeed slavery in general. And it's so important for us, guys, to fight against this effort by the Republican Party and by MAGA extremists to try to erase and marginalize the history of slavery. As disgusting as slavery is, it is part of our history. It's part of this country's history. So why do I bring this entire thing up? I bring this up because I feel that it's really important for us to learn from history, not try to rewrite history so that we make the same mistakes over again, which is what the Republican Party is trying to do, but to learn from what's happened in history so that we don't make the same mistakes again. We cannot marginalize this history of slavery because we don't ever want to go back to a place in time where this kind of thing is even remotely allowed, right? And while I don't think necessarily that America would go back to slavery, well, I guess you never know because of how extreme the MAGA cult is, I don't necessarily feel that we'd go back to slavery, but the ideas, right? The ideology of these people is still the same, the subjugation of entire groups of people. This is sort of the legacy of slavery, and this is what we cannot ever allow to happen in the future. Because we all know at the end of the day that the Republican Party is not a progressive party. The Republican Party is a party that wants to go back in time to the way things were. This entire thing with Nikki Haley illustrates why I am so passionate about supporting the Democratic Party. Because while the Democratic Party certainly hasn't been perfect, you're not going to get that argument from me that the Democratic Party is perfect because they certainly haven't been. But the democratic ideals are in the right place for humanity, right? These ideals of equality for all people, regardless of your ethnicity, your race, your gender, your sexual preference, regardless of all those things, everybody can be equal and free to pursue happiness in life. That is a very democratic ideal. These are the very things that the Republican Party hates about the Democratic Party. They're a party of superiority, not equality. They don't want women to have rights. They don't want the LGBTQ community to have rights. They don't want minorities to have rights. They want a society based on hierarchy where they are at the very top and everyone else is inferior. So in my opinion, this is why we have to fight against these very backwards Republican ideologies, right? The idea that there is a hierarchy in society, the idea that one group of individuals is superior to others based on ethnicity, race, sexual preference, gender, all of these concepts. We have to reject those ideas, and we have to embrace the very democratic idea that all human beings are equal. All human beings want the same things out of life. So guys, as far as I'm concerned, this guy who checked Nikki Haley on her awful revisionist history response on what caused the Civil War is a hero, in my opinion. And we need more people like this throughout this country to check Republicans, to check MAGA extremists whenever they try to rewrite history like this, right? Whenever they go on their revisionist history narratives, we need people to stand up and say, hey, no, you're not going to hide from the past. We're not going to let you hide from the effect and the causes of your ideologies, because we need to be able to move past all of these conservative and all of these terrible ideologies from the past of this country and move forward to a future in this country that embraces all people, regardless of what you look like, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your gender, regardless of your sexual preference. We are all equal at the end of the day, and everybody needs to be treated as such. Thank you so much for watching this video and sticking around to the end. If you like and appreciate this content, please like and subscribe. It helps so much, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.